Section 8 of The Girl from the Marshcroft by Selma Lagerlöf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Lars Rolander. Section 8 The Silver Mine. King Gustav III was traveling through Dalecarlia. He was pressed for time, and all the way he wanted to drive like lightning. Although they drove with such speed that the horses were extended like stretched rubber bands and the coach cleared the turns on two wheels, the king poked his head out of the window and shouted to the postilion, "Why don't you go ahead? Do you think you are driving over eggs?" Since they had to drive over poor country roads at such a mad pace, it would have been almost a miracle had the harness and the wagon held together. And they didn't either, for at the foot of a steep hill the pole broke, and there the king sat. The courtiers sprang from the coach and scolded the driver, but this did not lessen the damage done. There was no possibility of continuing the journey until the coach was mended. When the courtiers looked round to try to find something with which the king could amuse himself while he waited, they noticed a church spire looming high above the trees in a grove a short distance ahead. They intimated to the king that he might step into one of the coaches in which the attendants were riding and drive up to the church. It was a Sunday, and the king might attend service to pass the time until the royal coach was ready. The king accepted the proposal and drove toward the church. He had been traveling for hours through dark forest regions, but here it looked more cheerful, with fairly large meadows and villages, and with the dull river gliding on, light and pretty, between thick rows of alder bushes. But the king had ill luck to this extent. The bell ringer took up the recessional chant just as the king was stepping from the coach on the church knoll, and the people were coming out from the service. But when they came walking past him, the king remained standing, with one foot in the wagon and the other on the footstep. He did not move from the spot, only stared at them. They were the finest lot of folk he had ever seen. All the men were above the average height, with intelligent and earnest faces, and the women were dignified and stately, with an air of Sabbath peace about them. The whole of the preceding day the king had talked only of the desolate tracts he was passing through, and had said to his courtiers again and again, "Now I am certainly driving through the very poorest part of my kingdom." But now, when he saw the people, garbed in the picturesque dress of this section of the country, he forgot to think of their poverty. Instead, his heart warmed, and he remarked to himself, "The King of Sweden is not so badly off as his enemies think. So long as my subjects look like this, I shall probably be able to defend both my faith and my country." He commanded the courtiers to make known to the people that the stranger who was standing amongst them was their king, and that they should gather around him so he could talk to them. And then the king made a speech to the people. He spoke from the high steps outside the vestry, and the narrow step upon which he stood is there even to-day. The king gave an account of the sad plight in which the kingdom was placed. He said that the Swedes were threatened with war both by Russians and Danes. Under ordinary circumstances it wouldn't be such a serious matter, but now the army was filled with traitors, and he did not dare depend upon it. Therefore there was no other course for him to pursue than to go himself into the country settlements and ask his subjects if they would be loyal to their king and help him with men and money so he could save the fatherland. The peasants stood quietly while the king was speaking, and when he had finished they gave no sign either of approval or disapproval. The king himself thought that he had spoken very well. The tears had sprung to his eyes several times while he was speaking. But when the peasants stood there all the while, troubled and undecided, and could not make up their minds to answer him, the king frowned and looked displeased. The peasants understood that it was becoming monotonous for the king to wait, and finally one of them stepped out from the crowd. "Now you must know, King Gustaf, that we were not expecting a royal visit in the parish to day," said the peasant, "and therefore we are not prepared to answer you at once. I advise you to go into the vestry and speak with our pastor, while we discuss among ourselves this matter which you have laid before us." The king apprehended that a more satisfactory response was not to be had immediately, so he felt that it would be best for him to follow the peasant's advice. When he came into the vestry, he found no one there but a man who looked like a peasant. He was tall and rugged, with big hands toughened by labor, and he wore neither cassock nor collar, but leather breeches and a long white homespun coat, like all the other men. He arose and bowed to the king when the latter entered. "I thought I should find the parson in here," said the king. The man grew somewhat red in the face. He thought it annoying to mention the fact that he was the parson of this parish, when he saw that the king had mistaken him for a peasant. "Yes," said he, "the parson is usually on hand in here." The king dropped into a large armchair which stood in the vestry at that time, and which stands there to day, looking exactly like itself, with this difference: the congregation has had a gilded crown attached to the back of it. "Have you a good parson in this parish?" asked the king, who wanted to appear interested in the welfare of the peasants. When the king questioned him in this manner, the parson felt that he couldn't possibly tell who he was. "It is better to let him go on believing that I am only a peasant," thought he, and replied that the parson was good enough. He preached a pure and clear gospel, and tried to live as he taught. The king thought that this was a good commendation, but he had a sharp ear and marked a certain doubt in the tone. "You sound as if you were not quite satisfied with the parson," said the king. "He is a bit arbitrary," said the man, thinking that if the king should find out later who he was, he would not think that the parson had been standing here and blowing his own horn. Therefore he wished to come out with a little fault finding also. "There are some, no doubt, who say the parson wants to be the only one to counsel and rule in this parish," he continued. "Then, at all events, he has led and managed in the best possible way," said the king. He didn't like it that the peasant complained of one who was placed above him. "To me it appears as though good habits and old time simplicity were the rule here." "The people are good enough," said the curate, "but then they live in poverty and isolation. Human beings here would certainly be no better than others if this world's temptations came closer to them." "But there's no fear of anything of the sort happening," said the king with a shrug. He said nothing further, but began thrumming on the table with his fingers. He thought he had exchanged a sufficient number of gracious words with this peasant, and wondered when the others would be ready with their answer. "These peasants are not very eager to help their king," thought he. "If I only had my coach, I would drive away from them and their palaver." The pastor sat there troubled, debating with himself as to how he should decide an important matter which he must settle. He was beginning to feel happy because he had not told the king who he was. Now he felt that he could speak with him about matters which otherwise he could not have placed before him. After a while the parson broke the silence and asked the king if it was an actual fact that enemies were upon them and that the kingdom was in danger. The king thought this man ought to have sense enough not to trouble him further. He simply glared at him and said nothing. "I asked because I was standing in here and could not hear very well," said the parson. "But if this is really the case, I want to say to you that the pastor of this congregation might perhaps be able to procure for the king as much money as he will need." "I thought you said just now that every one here was poor," said the king, thinking that the man didn't know what he was talking about. "Yes, that is true," replied the rector, "and the parson has no more than any of the others. But if the king would condescend to listen to me for a moment, I will explain how the pastor happens to have the power to help him." "You may speak," said the king. "You seem to find it easier to get the words past your lips than your friends and neighbors out there, who never will be ready with what they have to tell me." "It is not so easy to reply to the king. I am afraid that in the end it will be the parson who must undertake this on behalf of the others." The king crossed his legs, folded his arms, and let his head sink down on his breast. "You may begin now," he said in the tone of one already asleep. "Once upon a time there were 5 men from this parish who were out on a moose hunt," began the clergyman. "One of them was the parson of whom we are speaking. 2 of the others were soldiers named Olaf and Erik Svärd. The 4th man was the innkeeper in this settlement, and the 5th was a peasant named Israel Per Persson." "Do not go to the trouble of mentioning so many names," muttered the king, letting his head droop to the side. "Those men were good hunters," continued the parson, "who usually had luck with them. But that day they had wandered long and far without getting anything. Finally they gave up the hunt altogether and sat down on the ground to talk. They said there was not a spot in the whole forest fit for cultivation. All of it was only mountain and swamp land. 'Our Lord has not done right by us in giving us such a poor land to live in,' said one. 'In other localities people can get riches for themselves in abundance, but here, with all our toil and drudgery, we can scarcely get our daily bread.'" The pastor paused a moment, as if uncertain that the king heard him, but the latter moved his little finger to show that he was awake. Just as the hunters were discussing this matter, the parson saw something that glittered at the base of the mountain, where he had kicked away a moss tuft. "This is a queer mountain," he thought, as he kicked off another moss tuft. He picked up a shiver of stone that came with the moss, and which shone exactly like the other. "It can't be possible that this stuff is lead," said he. Then the others sprang up and scraped away the turf with the butt end of their rifles. When they did this, they saw plainly that a broad vein of ore followed the mountain. "What do you think this might be?" asked the parson. The men chipped off bits of stone and bit into them. "It must be lead or zinc at least," said they. "And the whole mountain is full of it," added the innkeeper. When the parson had got thus far in his narrative, the king's head was seen to straighten up a little, and one eye opened. "Do you know if any of those persons knew anything about ore and minerals?" he asked. "They did not," replied the parson. Then the king's head sank and both eyes closed. "The clergyman and his companions were very happy," continued the speaker, without letting himself be disturbed by the king's indifference. "They fancied that now they had found that which would give them and their descendants wealth. 'I'll never have to do any more work,' said one. 'Now I can afford to do nothing at all the whole week through, and on Sundays I shall drive to church in a golden chariot.' They were otherwise sensible men, but the great find had gone to their heads, and they talked like children. Still, they had enough presence of mind to put back the moss tufts and conceal the vein of ore. Then they carefully noted the place where it was and went home. Before they parted company, they agreed that the parson should travel to Falun and ask the mining expert what kind of ore this was. He was to return as soon as possible, and until then they promised one another an oath not to reveal to a single soul where the ore was to be found. The king's head was raised again a trifle, but he did not interrupt the speaker with a word. It appeared as though he was beginning to believe that the man actually had something of importance he wished to say to him, since he didn't allow himself to be disturbed by his indifference. Then the parson departed with a few samples of ore in his pocket. He was just as happy in the thought of becoming rich as the others were. He was thinking of rebuilding the parsonage, which at present was no better than a peasant's cottage, and then he would marry a dean's daughter whom he liked. He had thought that he might have to wait for her many years. He was poor and obscure and knew that it would be a long while before he should get any post that would enable him to marry. The parson drove over to Falun in 2 days, and there he had to wait another whole day because the mining expert was away. Finally he ran across him and showed him the bits of ore. The mining expert took them in his hand. He looked at them first, then at the parson. The parson related how he had found them in a mountain at home in his parish, and wondered if it might not be lead. "No, it is not lead," said the mining expert. "Perhaps it is zinc, then?" asked the parson. "Nor is it zinc," said the mineralogist. The parson thought that all the hope within him sank. He had not been so depressed in many a long day. "Have you many stones like these in your parish?" asked the mineralogist. "We have a whole mountain full," said the parson. Then the mineralogist came up closer, slapped the parson on the shoulder, and said, "Let us see that you make such good use of this that it will prove a blessing both to yourselves and to the country, for this is silver." "Indeed?" said the parson, feeling his way. "So it is silver." The mineralogist began telling him how he should go to work to get legal rights to the mine, and gave him many valuable suggestions, but the parson stood there dazed and didn't listen to what he was saying. He was only thinking of how wonderful it was that at home in his poor parish stood a whole mountain of silver ore waiting for him. The king raised his head so suddenly that the parson stopped short in his narrative. "It turned out, of course, that when he got home and began working the mine, he saw that the mineralogist had only been fooling him," said the king. "Oh, no, the mineralogist had not fooled him," said the parson. "You may continue," said the king as he settled himself more comfortably in the chair to listen. "When the parson was at home again and was driving through the parish," continued the clergyman, "he thought that first of all he should inform his partners of the value of their find. And as he drove alongside the innkeeper Sten Stenson's place, he intended to drive up to the house to tell him they had found silver. But when he stopped outside the gate, he noticed that a broad path of evergreen was strewn all the way up to the doorstep. 'Who has died in this place?' asked the parson of a boy who stood leaning against the fence. 'The innkeeper himself,' answered the boy. Then he let the clergyman know that the innkeeper had drunk himself full every day for a week. 'Oh, so much brandy has been drunk here.' 'How can that be?' asked the parson. 'The innkeeper used never to drink himself full.' 'Oh,' said the boy, 'he drank because he said he had found a mine. He was very rich. He should never have to do anything now but drink, he said. Last night he drove off full as he was, and the wagon turned over and he was killed.' When the parson heard this, he drove homeward. He was distressed over what he had heard. He had come back so happy, rejoicing because he could tell the great good news. When the parson had driven a few paces, he saw Israel Per Persson walking along. He looked about as usual, and the parson thought it was well that fortune had not gone to his head too. Him he would cheer at once with the news that he was a rich man. "Good day," said Per Persson. "Do you come from Falun now?" "I do," said the parson. "And now I must tell you that it has turned out even better than we had imagined. The mineralogist said it was silver ore that we had found." That instant Per Persson looked as though the ground under him had opened. "What are you saying? What are you saying? Is it silver?" "Yes," answered the parson. "We'll all be rich men now, all of us, and can live like gentlemen." "Oh, is it silver?" said Per Persson once again, looking more and more mournful. "Why, of course it is silver," replied the parson. "You mustn't think that I want to deceive you. You mustn't be afraid of being happy." "Happy!" said Per Persson. "Should I be happy? I believed it was only glitter that we had found. So I thought it would be better to take the certain for the uncertain. I have sold my share in the mine to Olaf Svärd for $100. He was desperate, and when the parson drove away from him, he stood on the highway and wept. When the clergyman got back to his home, he sent a servant to Olaf Svärd and his brother to tell them that it was silver they had found. He thought that he had had quite enough of driving around and spreading the good news. But in the evening, when the parson sat alone, his joy asserted itself again. He went out in the darkness and stood on a hillock upon which he contemplated building the new parsonage. It should be imposing, of course, as fine as a bishop's palace. He stood out there long that night, nor did he content himself with rebuilding the parsonage. It occurred to him that since there were such riches to be found in the parish, throngs of people would pour in, and finally a whole city would be built around the mine, and then he would have to erect a new church in place of the old one. Towards this object a large portion of his wealth would probably go. And he was not content with this, either, but fancied that when his church was ready, the king and many bishops would come to the dedication. Then the king would be pleased with the church, but he would remark that there was no place where a king might put up, and then he would have to erect a castle in the new city. Just then one of the king's courtiers opened the door of the vestry and announced that the big royal coach was mended. At the first moment the king was ready to withdraw, but on second thought he changed his mind. "You may tell your story to the end," he said to the parson, "but you can hurry it a bit. We know all about how the man thought and dreamt. We want to know how he acted." "But while the parson was still lost in his dreams," continued the clergyman, "word came to him that Israel Per Persson had made away with himself. He had not been able to bear the disappointment of having sold his share in the mine. He had thought, no doubt, that he could not endure to go about every day, seeing another enjoying the wealth that might have been his." The king straightened up a little. He kept both eyes open. "Upon my word," he said, "if I had been that parson, I should have had enough of the mine." "The king is a rich man," said the parson. "He has quite enough at all events. It is not the same thing with the poor curate who possesses nothing. The unhappy wretch thought instead, when he saw that God's blessing was not with his enterprise, 'I will dream no more of bringing glory and profit to myself with these riches, but I can't let the silver lie buried in the earth. I must take it out for the benefit of the poor and needy. I will work the mine to put the whole parish on its feet.' So one day the parson went out to see Olaf Svärd to ask him and his brother as to what should be done immediately with the silver mountain. When he came in the vicinity of the barracks, he met a cart surrounded by armed peasants, and in the cart sat a man with his hands tied behind him and a rope around his ankles. When the parson passed by, the cart stopped, and he had time to regard the prisoner, whose head was tied up so it wasn't easy to see who he was. But the parson thought he recognized Olaf Svärd. He heard the prisoner beg those who guarded him to let him speak a few words with the parson. The parson drew nearer, and the prisoner turned toward him. "You will soon be the only one who knows where the silver mine is," said Olaf. "What are you saying, Olaf?" asked the parson. "Well, you see, parson, since we have learned that it was a silver mine we had found, my brother and I could no longer be as good friends as before. We were continually quarreling. Last night we got into a controversy over which one of us five it was who first discovered the mine. It ended in strife between us, and we came to blows. I have killed my brother, and he has left me with a souvenir across the forehead to remember him by. I must hang now, and then you will be the only one who knows anything about the mine. Therefore I wish to ask something of you." "Speak out," said the parson. "I'll do what I can for you." "You know that I'm leaving several little children behind me. began the soldier, but the parson interrupted him. "As regards this, you can rest easy. That which comes to your share in the mine they shall have, exactly as if you yourself were living." "No," said Olaf Svärd. "It was another thing I wanted to ask of you. Don't let them have any portion of that which comes from the mine." The parson staggered back a step. He stood there dumb and could not answer. "If you do not promise me this, I cannot die in peace," said the prisoner. "Yes," said the parson, slowly and painfully. "I promise you what you ask of me." Thereupon the murderer was taken away, and the parson stood on the highway thinking how he should keep the promise he had given him. On the way home he thought of the wealth which he had been so happy over. But if it really were true that the people in this community could not stand riches, already four were ruined who hitherto had been dignified and excellent men. He seemed to see the whole community before him, and he pictured to himself how this silver mine would destroy one after another. Was it befitting that he, who had been appointed to watch over these poor human beings' souls, should let loose upon them that which would be their destruction? All of a sudden the king sat bolt upright in his chair. "I declare," said he, "you'll make me understand that a parson in this isolated settlement must be every inch a man." "Nor was it enough with what had already happened," continued the parson. "For as soon as the news about the mine spread among the parishioners, they stopped working and went about in idleness, waiting for the time when great riches should pour in on them. All the never do wells there were in this section streamed in, and drunkenness and fighting were what the parson heard talked of continually. A lot of people did nothing but tramp round in the forest, searching for the mine. And the parson marked that as soon as he left the house, people followed him stealthily to find out if he wasn't going to the Silver Mountain and to steal the secret from him. When matters were come to this pass, the parson called the peasants together to vote. To start with, he reminded them of all the misfortunes which the discovery of the mountain had brought upon them, and he asked them if they were going to let themselves be ruined or if they would save themselves. Then he told them that they must not expect him, who was their spiritual adviser, to help on their destruction. Now he had decided not to reveal to anyone where the silver mine was, and never would he himself take riches from it. And then he asked the peasants how they would have it henceforth. If they wished to continue their search for the mine and wait upon riches, then he would go so far away that not a hearsay of their misery could reach him. But if they would give up thinking about the silver mine and be as heretofore, he would remain with them. "Whichever way you may choose," said the parson, "remember this, that from me no one shall ever know anything about the Silver Mountain." "Well," said the king, "how did they decide?" "They did as their pastor wished," said the parson. "They understood that he meant well by them, when he wanted to remain poor for their sakes, and they commissioned him to go to the forest and conceal the vein of ore with evergreen and stone, so that no one would be able to find it, neither they themselves nor their posterity." "And ever since the parson has been living here just as poor as the rest?" "Yes," answered the curate. "He has lived here just as poor as the rest." "He has married, of course, and built himself a new parsonage?" said the king. "No, he couldn't afford to marry, and he lives in the old cabin." "It's a pretty story that you have told me," said the king. After a few seconds he resumed. "Was it of the Silver Mountain that you were thinking when you said that the parson here would be able to procure for me as much money as I need?" "Yes," said the other. "But I can't put the thumbscrews on him," said the king. "Or how would you that I should get such a man to show me the mountain, a man who has renounced his sweetheart and all the allurements of life?" "Oh, that's a different matter," said the parson. But if it's the fatherland that is in need of the fortune, he will probably give in." "Will you answer for that?" asked the king. "Yes, that I will answer for," said the clergyman. "Doesn't he care then what becomes of his parishioners?" "That can rest in God's hand." The king rose from the chair and walked over to the window. He stood for a moment and looked upon the group of people outside. The longer he looked, the clearer his large eyes shone, and his figure seemed to grow. "You may greet the pastor of this congregation and say that for Sweden's king there is no sight more beautiful than to see a people such as this." Then the king turned from the window and looked at the clergyman. He began to smile. "Is it true that the pastor of this parish is so poor that he removes his black clothes as soon as the service is over and dresses himself like a peasant?" asked the king. "Yes, so poor is he," said the curate, and a crimson flush leaped into his rough-hewn face. The king went back to the window. One could see that he was in his best mood. All that was noble and great within him had been quickened into life. "You must let that mind lie in peace," said the king. "Inasmuch as you have labored and starved a lifetime to make this people such as you would have it, you may keep it as it is." "But if the kingdom is in danger?" said the parson. "The kingdom is better served with men than with money," remarked the king. When he had said this, he bade the clergyman farewell and went out from the vestry. Without stood the group of people, as quiet and taciturn as they were when he went in. As the king came down the steps, a peasant stepped up to him. "Have you had a talk with our pastor?" said the peasant. "Yes," said the king, "I have talked with him." "Then of course you have our answer?" said the peasant. "We asked you to go in and talk with our parson, that he might give you an answer from us." "I have the answer," said the king. End of section 8. Read by Lars Rolander.